All right, so welcome to week 2. We're continuing to talk about critical thinking in this class. And to be a critical and creative thinker, what is it and how can you accomplish it? Good question. Well, critical thinking, you can look at other references, not our books, but other books. There's a lot of books out there on critical thinking. And you could look at learning to think through a guide to critical thinking across curriculum, or Paul and Elder's 2006 book, Critical Thinking Tools for Taking Charge of Your Learning and Your Life. That's one of our books for this course. Oops, looks like it's stuck. Okay. Oops. Okay. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking is active and systematic process of communication, problem solving, evaluation, analysis, synthesis, reflection, both individually and in a community to foster understanding, support sound decision making, and guide action. Why is critical thinking important to students? Critical thinking is critical to employers. Can you analyze situations? Can you solve problems? Can you communicate your position logically? Can you make good decisions based on data and logic, not emotions or feelings? Why is critical thinking important to student learning? Good question. Why is it important for you? It's not just important for you to make life changes, making choices that could affect your life forever, or in business, whether to make this partnership or land a deal. But we use critical thinking all the time. Right now, you're using it as a student. You're thinking critically in classes, you're trying to do time management. So, college level learning is deeper than memorizing facts. Science, analyzing results of experiments in light of existing theories, math, selecting appropriate problem solving strategies, humanities, putting literature and art into historical context, health fields, evaluating patients and making decisions in clinical settings, communications, debate, persuasive writing, criminal justice, fire science, reacting correctly to simulations, political science and sociology, analyzing others' points of view. And there's common human analytical traits. Start with conclusions, convert thinking, favor your own intuitive solutions, take mental shortcuts, satisfies, take first acceptable solution, confuse discussion with analysis, rely too much on biased and bad assumptions, support solutions and evidence that reinforce our beliefs, and reject other solutions and evidence. Make decisions based on emotions, not reasoning. Most humans are functionally literate when it comes to complex analysis. Non-critical thinking characteristics: fun, exciting, feels good, attention getting, popular, patriotic, free, chick, spontaneous, advantageous, easy, beneficial to me, deeply moving and felt. Overcoming these poor thinking characteristics is a significant challenge. So yes, every now and then we find ourselves having some kind of barrier that can affect us thinking critically. Thinking is not created equally. A lot of times it has to do with the majority of people. Maybe there's poor thinking, aimless, emotionally driven, dogmatic, undisciplined. Where you want where we want you. We want you to be in quality thinking, accomplishes a goal, seeks truth, judicious, critical, generative, creative. There's fundamental and powerful concept here. Critical thinking, state, define. Critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to achieve better thinking. Elaborate. Critical thinking is reflective, involves standard, is authentic, involves being reasonable. Exemplify. When a medical doctor examines a patient, conducts medical tests. The process is active and systematic and results in correct diagnosis. When a person wages on a horse race based on their opinion about a horse's name is not critical thinking. Illustrate. Critical thinking is like a pair of binoculars. They allow you to get up close, explore details, put what you see in context, and understand more what you're seeing. What is creative thinking? Creative thinking differs from critical thinking and is expansive, focusing on producing unique solutions, new alternatives. Creative thinking requires you to temporarily suspend what you might know about a question or problem to gain different perspectives. And here you go. This is from Paul and Elder's book, The Foundation for Critical Thinking. We have point of view, purpose, implications, consequences, assumptions, essential concepts, interpretation and interference, and information and question. Right. Oops. Sorry, there's some kind of like little pop-up commercial there. All right, so this has to do with our chapter 2 kinds of reasoning today. Reasoning and critical thinking go hand in hand. We're going to look at today some techniques for understanding arguments as well. Don't forget to do your discussions for you to find that article and write about it. Please don't forget to do your reference as well for that. I do want to remind you that if you have any questions, you can always check with the Writing Center. Also, there is a guide I will show you before you leave today on the discussion post if you need some extra pointers and tips. So, a valid argument here. A valid argument has this characteristic. On the assumption that the premises are true, it's possible for conclusion to be false. Example here, premise. Every philosopher is a good mechanic, and premise here could be Emily is a philosopher. So, conclusion, Emily is a good mechanic. A valid argument here is every philosopher, that's a premise, is a good mechanic. And the premise here, Emily is a philosopher. So in conclusion, Emily is a good mechanic. These premises, if true, guarantee the conclusion is also true. Continuing with this valid argument, an example could be the premise, every philosopher is a good mechanic, and premise, Emily is a philosopher, so conclusion, Emily is a good mechanic. But these premises are not true, so the argument is valid but unsound, which makes it not a good argument. Deductive argument. A deductive argument is either valid or intended to be so by the author. Example, conclusion. Sheila's clarinet is French. Premise, it's a lebeautic, and premise here is all lebeautic instruments are made in France. This is a valid argument, and if the premises are true, it is also a sound argument, which would make it a good argument. A sound argument is a valid argument whose premises are true. Example premise, some pesticides are toxic for humans. And premise, anything that's toxic for humans is unsafe for most humans to consume. Therefore, conclusion, some pesticides are unsafe for most humans to consume. Valid argument. An argument is invalid when its conclusion does not necessarily follow the premises. Example, premise, every year, as far back as I can remember, my roses have developed mildew in the spring. Conclusion, therefore, my roses will develop mildew this spring too. Example, premise, every year, as far back as I can remember, my roses have developed mildew in the spring. Conclusion, therefore, my roses will develop mildew this spring too. This argument doesn't qualify as a valid or sound because it is possible that the conclusion is false or even assuming the premise is true. Nevertheless, this is not a bad argument. In fact, it's a strong argument. A strong argument has this characteristic. On the assumption that the premises are true, the conclusion is probably true or unlikely to be false. Example, the roses will probably get mildew again this spring. An inductive argument is an invalid argument whose premises are intended to provide some support, but less than conclusive support for the conclusion. If it was conclusive support, it would be valid rather than strong and deductive rather than inductive. Example, the ensemble played an encore at last year's concert, and I'm pretty sure they played one this year as well. So conclusion is that they most likely play an encore at this year's concert as well. Notice is not conclusive, but probably true. This means that it's a very strong argument and therefore a good argument. A good argument justifies acceptance of the conclusion. A sound argument can be valid and sound or invalid but strong. Premise indicators here: since, because, for, in view of, this is implied by. Some conclusion indicators to keep in mind are thus, therefore, hence, this shows that, this suggests that, consequently, so, accordingly, this implies that, this proves that. Let's think about this, true or false. When diagramming an argument, one should include claims that contradict the conclusion. True. This will help you figure out whether it is a good argument or not. True or false. When evaluating an argument, one should always take into consideration the existence and merit of any unstated premises. It's true. Many times, unstated premises are what makes an argument either valid or sound or strong. Unstated premises. When evaluating an argument with unstated premises, an appropriate tactic is to find a claim that would make the argument valid or strong and evaluate the argument as if the claim had been included. You can identify the following passages as containing an argument: two arguments or no argument. If it contains an argument, we can identify the conclusions, and if it contains two arguments, indicate which argument is the principal argument. Bamboo can grow up to 4 feet a day, but only after it's well established. This can take it from 3 to 5 years, depending on the type of bamboo. Answer is no argument. The Birminghams have invited the performers home for a reception following the recital, but it would be wise to let them know if you plan to attend because space is limited. The answer would be argument conclusion. It would be wise to let them know if you plan to attend. Fieldspar works at a restaurant at night and teaches during the day. I'd have to bet he's tired most of the time, and that's a good reason for thinking he won't do well in school this term. All right, so is that a good argument? Well, two arguments are present here. Conclusion, he's tired most of the time, and he won't do well in school this term. He won't do well is the conclusion of the principal argument. The market for Jackson Pollock paintings has collapsed virtually overnight. The reason? A lot of them were bought during the 1980s and 1990s. Investors figured that 1980s prices were too high. The market for Jackson Pollock paintings has collapsed virtually overnight. Reason? A lot of them were bought during the 1980s and 1990s. Investors figured that 1980s prices were too high. That's not a good argument. No argument. It is a very nice clock, but as you can see, it doesn't really go very well on my wall. For one thing, it's too large for the space. For another, it's red, and the wall is green. The best thing you can do with it, I'm afraid, is to take it back. Walmart is good about giving refunds. Answer. Two arguments are present. Conclusion. It doesn't really go well on the wall. And the best thing you can do with it, I'm afraid, is to take it back. The best thing you can do with it, the conclusion of the principal argument. Hey, what is that stuff you're cooking anyway? It smells like fish. Fish? What do you mean fish? That's a pot roast I'm cooking. Oh, say, you don't mind if I open a window, do you? No, it's not the fish, roast. It just seems sort of warm in here. Answer, no argument. In the last passage, the speaker is explaining, actually, pretending to explain why he or she wants to open the window, not giving an argument that the window should be opened. Imagine yourself naked, ooh, without weapons, and running after a deer. If you were to catch the deer, how would you eat it? Humans are not equipped with canine teeth in order to eat meat without tools. A carnivore's teeth are long and sharp, and his jaws move up and down. Humans, by contrast, use their molars to crush and grind their food. Have you ever noticed that so many Americans are overweight and unhealthy? That's because they eat meat. That's from a student paper. Is that a good argument? The argument conclusion is that meat is an appropriate or healthy diet for humans. Bill Clinton's behavior prior to his becoming president relevant to how he should be judged in office? Yes, 22%, and then no, 71%. From a telephone poll of 800 adult Americans taken for Time CNN by Amjad Partners Inc. So, this is not an argument. In case you don't remember that story, Bill Clinton said he had relations, but he didn't have relations with Monica Lewinsky, who happened to be one of his college interns. If you don't know your lawn at least once a week, what happens is that when you mow it, it will turn brown later. Answer. An argument in most contexts for the unstated conclusion that you ought to mow your lawn at least once a week. Supply, a general principle that, assuming it is true, makes the following into a relatively strong inductive argument. Sydney is 10, therefore she likes horses. Answer, 10-year-olds like horses. Supply, a general principle. Her home is in Santa Cruz, so I doubt it's depreciated in the last 5 years. Answer, home prices in Santa Cruz have depreciated in the last 5 years. Monica may have trouble sleeping tonight since she drank tea at 10 p.m. Answer, drinking caffeinated tea late in the day tends to keep people awake. So that's a good answer in case somebody asks, why? Well, drinking caffeinated tea late in the day keeps people awake. I bet TV doesn't work right. Josh was messing with it. And then someone said, when people mess with TVs, the TVs usually don't work right. Deborah loves American Idol. It's a good bet she watches Dancing with the Stars too. Answer, people who like American Idol generally watch Dancing with the Stars too. Mr. Zing has a background in psychology. He is bound to make a good chairman. Answer, people versed in psychology tend to make good administrators. All right. Now, getting into the book, there's 2 types of reasoning. Time to look more closely at arguments, the kind that actually show something, unlike the red herrings and emotional appeals and other fallacies we are going to be talking about in a moment. Today, we're continuing to learn about recognizing complications regarding premises and conclusions, and that's what I showed you in this PowerPoint right now. We're also going to be distinguishing between deductive and inductive arguments. We're going to be understanding the standards for validity, soundness, strength, and weakness in arguments. We're going to assess the argument with unstated premise. We're going to distinguish between ethos, pathos, and logos. we're going to identify a balance of considerations, argument, identify an inference to the best explanation, IBE, and use techniques for understanding arguments. Here's some general features. The statement is not an argument, God exists. Like the statement, likewise, this is not an argument, God exists. That's a plan as the nose on your face. It's just a slightly more empathetic statement, nor is this an argument. God exists, and if you don't believe it, you will go to hell. It just tries to scare us into believing God exists. So the difference between this and the early examples, this example has a premise, something to cause the universe, and a conclusion. As we explained in chapter 1, an argument always has two parts, premise part and conclusion part. The premise part is intended to give reason for accepting the conclusion part. It probably seems fairly straightforward, but one or two complications are worth nothing. So here's the premise. The brakes aren't working, the engine burns oil. The transmission needs work and the car is hard to start. Conclusion 1. The car outlived its usefulness. That's conclusion 2. Or and number 2, we should get a new car. The car outlived the usefulness. Is a conclusion for one argument. And that's good because some people think a car should last forever. Other people say it should only be like 1 or 2. So clearly, if a premise has an argument or unseen controversial, it has been challenged. Okay, or here's another one down here. Another complication argument is like you can't check out books from the library without an ID. Conclusion, Bill won't be able to check out any books. An unstated premise is that Bill has no ID. Argument could even have an unstated conclusion. Example, political party that reflected the mainstream opinion will win the presidency, and Republican Party best reflects the mainstream options. Some conclusion indicators here could be when the words in the following list are used in arguments. And the 3 dot represent the claim and the conclusion, plus, therefore, hence, this shows that, this suggests that, consequently, so, accordingly, implies that, improves in that. An example, Stacy drives a Porsche. This suggests that either she is rich or her parents are. The conclusion is either she's rich or parents are, and the premise is that Stacy drives a Porsche. There's two kinds of arguments here. You have the deductive and you have the other one. Okay, so you can look at the other ones, inductive. Let's look at the deductive first. The premises of a good deductive argument, if true, proves or demonstrates, these are the same for purposes, its conclusion. However, there is more than meets the eye, and we must begin with the fundamental concept of deductive logic, validity. An argument is valid if it isn't possible for the premise to be true and conclusion false. This may sound complicated, but it really isn't. An example is a valid argument will help. Premise. Okay. Jimmy Carter was president immediately before Bill Clinton, and George Bush was president immediately after Bill Clinton. Okay, it's kind of repetitive there. It repeats itself, but that's the premise. The conclusion is that Jimmy Carter was president after George Bush. I mean, instead of making it all so wordy, you could just say Jimmy Carter is president after George Bush. Premise indicators here, you have different premises when the words we have since, for, in view of, this is implied by, Example, either Stacy is rich or her parents since she drives a Porsche. The premise is the claim that Stacy drives a Porsche, and conclusion as that the claim is either Stacy is rich or her parents are. As you can see, it's impossible for the premise to be true and this conclusion to be false, so the argument is valid. However, you may have noticed that the premise contains a mistake, and Jimmy Carter was not president immediately after Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush was president immediately before Bill Clinton. Nevertheless, even though the premises of the preceding argument is not true, the argument is still valid because there isn't possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion is false. Another way of saying this is if the premise were true, the conclusion would not be false, and that's a valid means. Now, when the premise of a valid argument is true, there would be a word for it, and there's a sound. Premise: Bill Clinton is taller than George W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter is shorter than George Bush. Therefore, Bill Clinton is taller than Jimmy Carter. Inductive arguments. Again, the premise for good deductive argument is true, demonstrates the conclusion is true. This brings us to the second kind of argument, the inductive argument. And premises of good inductive arguments don't demonstrate their conclusions, they support it. For example, a woman has been found murdered. The husband knows and threatened her repeatedly. That fact certainly does not demonstrate the woman's husband murdered her, but by itself, the fact barely even supports that conclusion. But it does support it slightly. It raises possibility slightly that the husband was a murderer. Certainly, the investigators could question the husband closely if they learned he repeatedly threatened his wife before she died. If you're thinking that the support is a matter of degrees and that the varying from just a little to a whole lot, you're right. If you say the husband's fingerprints had found on the murder weapon, that fact would offer much better support for the conclusion that the husband was a murderer. That is, it would make it likelier that the woman's murderer was her husband. Inductive arguments are thus better or worse on the slide scale, depending on how much support their premises provide for the conclusion. Logicians have a technical word to describe the situation. The more support the premise of the inductive argument provides for the conclusion, the stronger argument, the less support it provides. The weaker argument. Put it another way, the more likely the premise makes the conclusion, the stronger the argument, the less likely the weaker the argument. Discovering the man repeatedly threatened his wife, that's a premise, raised the probability slightly that he or she was a murderer. That's the conclusion. By comparison, discovering the fingerprints on the murder weapon raises the possibility by a much larger jump or the stronger of the two arguments. Abe Lincoln knew the logic. We have validity and soundness of Lincoln-Douglas debates. Here's Abraham Lincoln speaking at the 5th Lincoln-Douglas debate. I state in this logistic form of the argument, nothing in the Constitution can destroy a right distinctively and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. The right of a property slave is distinctively and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. Therefore, nothing in the Constitution can destroy the right of property in a slave. Lincoln goes to say there's a fault in the argument, and the fault is not the reasons, but the falsehood, in fact, is the fault of the premises. I believe the right to property in a slave is not distinctively and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. In other words, the argument is valid, Lincoln says, but unsound and thus not a good argument. Syllogisms, by the way, are covered in the chapter 8. Today we're looking at chapter 2. It's time for a little video. I know, we've been working hard. We've been working for 30 minutes looking at the PowerPoints and the work. Okay, here's a little video from TED Ed. This tool will help you improve your critical thinking. Video, right? Don't leave because the video is about ready to play. Sorry for the commercials.
Socrates, one of the founding fathers of Western philosophical thought, was on trial. Many Athenians believed he was a dangerous enemy of the state, accusing the philosopher of corrupting the youth and refusing to recognize their gods. However, Socrates wasn't feared for claiming to have all the answers, but rather for asking too many questions. While he loathed formal lectures, the philosopher frequently engaged friends and strangers in lengthy conversations about morality and society. These discussions weren't debates, nor would Socrates offer explicit advice. In fact, the philosopher often claimed to know nothing at all, responding to his partner's answers only with further questions. But through this process, Socrates probed their logic, revealing its flaws and helping both parties reach a more robust understanding. These insightful questions made Socrates beloved by his followers. Two of his students, Plato and Xenophon, were so inspired that they replicated their mentor's process in fictional dialogues. These invented exchanges provide perfect examples of what would come to be known as the Socratic method. In one of these fabricated dialogues, Socrates is conversing with a young man named Euthydemus, who is confident that he understands the nature of justice and injustice. Socrates probes the student's values by asking him to label actions such as lying and theft as just or unjust. Euthydemus confidently categorizes them as injustices, but this only prompts another question. Is it just for a general to deceive or pillage a hostile army? Euthydemus revises his assertion. He claims that these actions are just when done to enemies, and unjust when done to friends. But Socrates isn't finished. He asks the young man to consider a commander lying to his troops to boost their morale. Before long, Euthydemus is despondent. It seems that every answer leads to further problems, and perhaps he's not quite sure what constitutes justice after all. In employing this question-oriented approach, Socrates described himself as a midwife, whose inquiries assist others in giving birth to their ideas. His method of questioning draws out an individual's unexamined assumptions and then challenges those biases. It doesn't always provide definitive answers, but the method helps clarify the questions and eliminate contradictory or circular logic. And by following a line of inquiry where it logically leads, both the question asker and answerer can end up in unexpected places. This technique isn't limited by the conversation's content, making it incredibly useful in numerous fields. During the Renaissance, the method was used to teach clinical medicine. Students proposed their rationale for different diagnoses, while a doctor questioned their assumptions and moderated discussion. In this model, the method could even produce conclusive results. This same approach was later used in other sciences, such as astronomy, botany, and mathematics. Following the Protestant Reformation, it was adapted to tackle abstract questions of faith. In the 19th century, the method became an essential part of American legal education. Professors explored students' understanding of judicial reasoning by challenging them with unforeseen hypothetical situations. This approach is still used today by the Supreme Court to imagine the unintended impacts of passing a law. The Socratic method can be adapted to teach almost any topic that relies on critical reasoning, but its success depends on the teacher employing it. An effective Socratic educator must be well-versed in their subject. Rather than bullying their students or showing off their superior intellect, they should be modest, genuinely curious, and affirming of every contribution. In this regard, Socrates himself may not have been the most subtle Socratic teacher. Historians believe he was deeply critical of Athens' particular brand of democracy and known to pass those concerns on to his followers. These subversive beliefs were distorted in public forums and thought to have inspired two of his pupils to treasonous ends. It was likely for these ideas Socrates was brought to trial and eventually sentenced to death. But even on his deathbed, artists depict a serene philosopher, ever curious to explore the ultimate question. What was life like in Socrates' Athens? Travel back in time to 427 BCE and experience how an ancient democracy made its decisions.
All right, so hold on a second.
Braden has
Okay, here's 5 steps to improve your critical thinking by Samantha Argos.
Every day, a sea of decisions stretches before us. Some are small and unimportant, but others have a larger impact on our lives. For example, which politician should I vote for? Should I try the latest diet craze? Or will email make me a millionaire? We're bombarded with so many decisions that it's impossible to make a perfect choice every time. But there are many ways to improve our chances, and one particularly effective technique is critical thinking. This is a way of approaching a question that allows us to carefully deconstruct a situation, reveal its hidden issues, such as bias and manipulation, and make the best decision. If the critical part sounds negative, that's because, in a way, it is. Rather than choosing an answer because it feels right, a person who uses critical thinking subjects all available options to scrutiny and skepticism. Using the tools at their disposal, they'll eliminate everything but the most useful and reliable information. There are many different ways of approaching critical thinking, but here's one 5-step process that may help you solve any number of problems. 1. Formulate your question. In other words, know what you're looking for. This isn't always as straightforward as it sounds. For example, if you're deciding whether to try out the newest diet craze, your reasons for doing so may be obscured by other factors, like claims that you'll see results in just 2 weeks. But if you approach the situation with a clear view of what you're actually trying to accomplish by dieting, whether that's weight loss, better nutrition, or having more energy, that'll equip you to sift through this information critically, find what you're looking for, and decide whether the new fad really suits your needs. 2. Gather your information. There's lots of it out there, so having a clear idea of your question will help you determine what's relevant. If you're trying to decide on a diet to improve your nutrition, you may ask an expert for their advice or seek other people's testimonies. Information gathering helps you weigh different options, moving you closer to a decision that meets your goal. 3. Apply the information, something you do by asking critical questions. Facing a decision, ask yourself, what concepts are at work? What assumptions exist? Is my interpretation of the information logically sound? For example, in an email that promises you millions, you should consider, what is shaping my approach to this situation? Do I assume the sender is telling the truth? Based on the evidence, is it logical to assume I'll win any money? 4. Consider the implications. Imagine it's election time, and you've selected a political candidate based on their promise to make it cheaper for drivers to fill up on gas. At first glance, that seems great. But what about the long-term environmental effects? If gasoline use is less restricted by cost, this could also cause a huge surge in air pollution, an unintended consequence that's important to think about. 5. Explore other points of view. Ask yourself why so many people are drawn to the policies of the opposing political candidate. Even if you disagree with everything that candidate says, exploring the full spectrum of viewpoints might explain why some policies that don't seem valid to you appeal to others. This will allow you to explore alternatives, evaluate your own choices, and ultimately help you make more informed decisions. This 5-step process is just one tool, and it certainly won't eradicate difficult decisions from our lives, but it can help us increase the number of positive choices we make. Critical thinking can give us the tools to sift through a sea of information and find what we're looking for. And if enough of us use it, it has the power to make the world a more reasonable place. Every day.
Okay, good. Okay, now we're back to the book. So many instructors, we use the word strong in absolute sense to denote only those arguments whose premises give the conclusion better than 50-50 chance of being true. In our book, however, we use strong and weak in a comparative sense. Given 2 arguments for the same conclusion, one whose premise makes a conclusion more likely is stronger argument, and the other is weaker. There's a lot of concept for you to remember, but you shouldn't let your surprise your instructor ask you to do so. To make this task easier, let's summarize. When we have reasoned deductively, we try to prove or demonstrate a conclusion. A deductive argument is said to be valid if it isn't possible for the premise to be true and conclusion to be false. Further, if the premise is a valid argument, its fact is true, the argument is said to be sound, and conclusion of a sound argument is proved or demonstrated. When we reason inductively, we try to support a conclusion. Inductive arguments are stronger, weaker, depending on how much support the premise provides for the conclusion and depending on how many premise makes the conclusion. Beyond a reasonable doubt, in common law, the highest standard of proof is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're a juror in a criminal trial, the evidence will be represented in court. Facts about interested parties considered relevant to the crime. Additionally, the prosecutor and the counsel for the defense will offer arguments connected to the evidence to or disconnecting it from the guilt of innocence of the defendant. When a jury is asked to return to the verdict, the judge will tell the jury what the defendant must be found not guilty unless the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt actually is somewhat lower standard than inductive demonstration. The later corresponds more to what in ordinary English might be expressed by the phrase beyond possible doubt. Recall in logic, a proposition has been demonstrated, and when it's shown to be the conclusion of a sound argument, an argument that is which all premises are true, and two impossible with premises to be true and conclusions to be false. In this sense, many propositions people describe as having demonstrated or proved, such as smoking causes lung cancer or DNA found in a crime scene, was a defendant, actually been proved in our sense of the world. So in real life, when people say something has been demonstrated, they well as was speaking informally, and they not mean something that is conclusion of sound argument. However, we, the authors, say that something's been demonstrated is actually what we mean. Induction, deduction, induction, and stated premises. Stated premises, the wind is from the south. Unstated premises around here. South winds are actually followed by rain. Conclusion, there will be rain. In other words, the speaker was merely trying to show that rain was a good possibility. Notice, though, the unstated premise in this argument could have been universal statement to the effect that the south wind always followed by rain, particular location, in which the case of the argument would be inductive. Stated premise, the wind is from the south. Unstated premise, around here, the south wind is always followed by rain. Conclusion, rain is coming. Spelled out this way, the speaker's thinking is inductive, it's possible premises are true, conclusion is false. One might wonder abstractly what the speaker intended, and deductive argument supports belief that rain is coming in deductive demonstration. There is perhaps no way to be certain, sort of asking the speaker something like, are you 100% positive? Experience, background knowledge. All right, so look right here. An example you over here is someone saying, Stacy and Justin are on the brink of divorce. They're always fighting. One could come to the valid deductive argument by adding that the universal statement, every couple is fighting at the brink of divorce. But such an unqualified universal statement seems unlikely. Perhaps the speaker wasn't trying to demonstrate that Stacy and Justin are at the brink of divorce. He or she is merely trying to raise that likelihood. Often it's clear that the speaker does not have a deductive argument in mind, and that some appropriate premise unstated. You overhear Professor Green saying, Professor Brown, flunk her. The second time you caught her cheating. It would seem strange to think that Professor Green's merely trying to make more likely that Professor Brown should flunk her student. Indeed, it's hard to even make sense of the suggestion. Professor Green's argument spelled out must be unstated premise. This is one caught cheating. Unstated premise, anyone caught cheating 2 times more to be flunked. Conclusion, she should be flunked. In context, the context will make it clear. Unstated premise, speaker in mind whether the argument is deductive or deductive. Fortunately, though, it isn't always the case. We might hear someone say the bars are closed, therefore it's later than 2 a.m. If the unstated premise of the speaker's mind is something like in the city, all the bars close at 2 a.m., and presumably he or she is thinking deductively and eventually proofing proof that after 2, the speaker's unstated premise is something like most bars in the city close between 2 a.m. and bars in the city usually close at 2 a.m., which was an inductive argument that merely supports the conclusion. So, which is the unstated premise? We really can't say without knowing more about the situation or the speaker. The bottom line is this: real life arguments often leave the premise unstated. One such unstated premise might make the argument inductive. Another might make it deductive. Usually context or context will probably clear what's intended. Other times they're not. When they don't, the best practice is to attribute to the speaker an unstated premise that at least is believable. Everything considered, we'll talk about believability in the chapter 4. Is this an ADA argument? Well, it looks like they're at the beach. No, it's no longer version. Still no. Advertising photograph can give you a reason for buying something or making it a cause of a reason. The photo is not, I cannot be arguing for anything. It just makes me want to go to the beach. Should I get a dog? A class to attend my cousin's wedding, vote for Obama, get chemo. Much everyday reason involves weighing considerations for and against thinking or doing something. Indeed, the case can be made for balance of considering reasoning as the most important kind of reasoning we do. A balance of considerations reasoning typically contains both deductive and inductive elements. When Jamala predicts that she can take care of little piglet, we hope that you read that in chapter 1 last week. She's been reasoning inductively. On the other hand, she concludes that one consideration outweighs another consideration. She's been reasoning deductively based on the relative values she's assigned to two considerations. Assigning values to considerations can be difficult, of course, but doing so is hopelessly arbitrary, as perhaps we convinced you. In chapter 1, chapter 12 of the book, we discuss the frameworks within moral evaluations are made, and you see that there's reasoning involves deductions from more guiding moral principles. Oh, it's time for us to take a little 10-minute break. Right, timer set. All right, welcome back from the break. Does it pop up here? Yay. What are not premises, conclusions, or arguments? That's a good point. We talked about sometimes what somebody might say seems like an assumption. It's not really an argument, but other things could also not be considered arguments, like pictures. It could be a picture of a sunrise. And then you have sentences. And you have different arguments. How about A because of B? That could be something. Sometimes it's because refers to cause of something, but other times it refers to a premise of an argument. Mike locks into the Hope Motel lobby wearing a swimsuit and dripping wet. Consider these statements. Mike is in a swimsuit because he's swimming. Mike is in a swimsuit because he's in a swimsuit. Okay. Those are the same form of X because of Y, but sentence to the left explains why he's wearing a swimsuit. The sentence number 2 is just repeating itself. So the sentence on the right offers an argument that Mike was swimming. Only the sentence on the right is an argument. You're going to put it this way. What follows because of a sentence is the left is the cause. What follows because on the right hand is evidence. Be sure you understand the difference between these two sentences. Arguments as cause and effect statements can both employ this phrase, X because of Y. But there are similarity ends. When what follows because is reason for accepting a contingent, we have an argument. What follows because states the cause of something, and we have cause and effect explanation. These are entirely different enterprises. Arguing that a dog has fleas is different from explaining it gave it fleas. Arguing that violent crime is increased is different from explaining what caused it to increase. We have pathos, logos, ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos is ETH, so I always have people think of ethos, ethics. Pathos is emotions. A lot of times we pathological liars are emotional, so that's how I remember that one. And logos is logic. Okay, that's our critical thinking, logos. Ethos was not just ethics, but also credibility too. So those you can remember. Those are from Aristotle. So this is like way back in the days. You know, Socrates was Plato's student, and Aristotle was Plato's student, and then you have Alexander the Great, who was Aristotle's student. So when he was a young man, Alexander the Great conquered the world. Alexander was enormously proud of his accomplishment and celebrated by renaming him cities after himself. Alexander's teacher, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, had no cities named after him. Nonetheless, his imprint of civilization turned out to be even more profound than Alexander's. Aristotle, who is now regarded as the father of logic, biology, and philosophy, made enduring contributions to virtually every subject. These include addition to those mentioned physics, astrology, meteorology, zoology, metaphysics, political science, economics, ethics, and rhetoric. Among Aristotle's contributions, the last field of rhetoric was theory of persuasion, which famously contained the idea that there are 3 modes by which the speaker may persuade the audience. Paraphrasing very loosely, Aristotle's idea is that they can be persuaded, first of all, by a speaker's personal attributes, concluding such thing as his or her background, reputation, accomplishments, enterprise, and some more things. Aristotle referred to the mode of persuasion as ethos. Second, the speaker can persuade us by connecting with the personal level. By arousing and appealing our emotions by a skillful use of rhetoric. Fortunately, logos, rational argumentation, is one of the least effective ways of winning someone into the point of view. Right. Moving on. There are different techniques for understanding arguments. If an argument has been offered to us, therefore we can evaluate it, we must understand and stand for it. Many arguments are difficult to understand because they are spoken and they go quickly. We cannot be sure the conclusion of the premises. Others are difficult to understand because they have complicated structure. Still others are difficult to understand because they have embedded the non-argumental material consisting of background information, prejudicial coloring, illustrations, parenthetical remarks, digressions, subsidiary points, and other window dressing. Clarifying argument structure, let's begin with how to understand relationships among arguments. The problem is sometimes it's easiest to solve. If you are dealing with written material, then you can mark it up. One useful technique is a number of premises and conclusions and the use of numbers to lay bare the structure in the argument. Like, I don't think we should get Carlos his own car. As a matter of fact, he's not responsible because he doesn't care for his things. And anyway, we don't have enough money for a car since now we are having trouble making ends meet. Last week, you yourself complained about our financial situation and you never complained without good reason. Right, so there you go. Those are some premises. You break it down like this. And you can distinguish arguments from the window dressing. It's not easy to isolate an argument in a speech or a written piece. Often speakers and writers think that because their main points are more or less clear to them, they will be equally apparent to listeners and readers. But it doesn't always work that way. If you have trouble identifying conclusion in that you hear or read, it could be a passage, is not an argument at all. Make sure the passage and conclusion is not a report, a description or explanation, or something else altogether rather than an argument. The key here is determining whether the speaker or other writer is offering reasons intended to support or demonstrate one or more claims. The problem could be that the conclusion is left unstated. Sometimes it helps simply to put the argument aside and ask yourself, what's this person trying to prove? In this case, the first essential step is understanding an argument is to spot a conclusion. If you're having difficulty identifying premises, consider a possibility. And you can't find premises to a piece of pure rhetoric because there are no premises. You will have an advantage over students having learned about rhetoric in the next chapters 5, 6, and 7. By the time you're getting pretty good at recognizing them. As you apply what you learned in this book of arguments, you encounter those in real life. You're to adapt to encounter arguments or argumentative essays whose organization is difficult to comprehend. When you do, you find diagramming a useful technique. Also, it's obvious we said in the section applies to the arguments that gives us or otherwise encounter. You don't diagram what's in your head, though you be clear in your own conclusions, attentive or otherwise, the reasons that you have accepting them. However, the diagramming technique does not apply to material you write. An employer introduced himself to the new gardener. I am a professor of logic, the employer said. Oh, what's that? The gardener said. I shall give you a demonstration, announced the professor. Do you have a wheelbarrow? Yes, replied the gardener. Then I infer that you're a hard worker, said the professor and continued. And from that I infer that you have a family, and I infer that you're conscientious and responsible, and that you infer that you're conservative. Am I right? Whoa, explained the gardener. That's right. What's the lot? So that's logic? That's logic, repeated the professor. Later, the gardener met up with his buddies and told them about the job as a professor of logic. Logic, his friend said. What's that? I'll show you, said the gardener. Do you own a wheelbarrow? No. Stupid liberal. It's a joke. If you don't get it, it's okay. Thinking critically requires us to evaluate argument. And evaluating arguments has two parts. First, there's logic part. Does the argument either demonstrate or support the conclusion? Is the argument either deductive valid or inductively relatively strong? You know now that the questions mean theoretically over the course of the book, you're bound to involve that fact. Another part, of course, the truth part. Our premise is actually true. We explain in chapter 4. So the main parts here was arguments consist of a premise or premises and a conclusion. The same claim can be premise in the argument, conclusion in the second argument. The two fundamental types of reasoning are deductive demonstration and inductive support. A deductive argument is used to demonstrate or prove a conclusion which does not sound An argument is sound if it's valid in premise or premises are true. An argument is valid if it's impossible for the premise or premises to be true and conclusion to be false. An inductive argument is used to support rather than demonstrate a conclusion. Support is a matter of degrees. An argument supports a conclusion to be extent to the premise or premises to make a conclusion likely. An argument that offers more support for a conclusion is said to be stronger than one that offers less support. The later is said to be weaker than the former, and some instructors use the word strong in absolute sense to denote inductive arguments whose premise or premises make conclusion more likely or not. Inductive arguments and deductive arguments can be on stated premises. Whether an argument is deductive or inductive may depend on the unstated premises is said to be. If an argument you're contemplating is somebody has offended you and you're having trouble tracking part of an argument that appears in written passage, try diagramming the passage. Balance of considerations reasoning involves deductive and inductive elements. If considering you're compared to qualitatively, weighing them involves deductive reasoning. Predictions as outcomes involve deductive reasoning, and inference is the best explanation is a common type of inductive reasoning in which one tries to demonstrate the best explanation for a phenomenon by comparing alternative hypotheses in terms of explanatory adequacy, predictive accuracy, and capability, as well as well-accepted explanations and freedom from unnecessary assumptions. All right, so we have our TED Talk for you to watch. Okay. Critical thinking. Does it matter by Bart Miller? Yes, it does. There's a fair share of stupid and ignorant people in the world, and there's a wall between trusting and not being able to trust. Do you believe this? You're not alone. So here's a video.
If you don't live in a really dense urban area that can support having a Whole Foods and Erewhon, you're kind of
to talk. I'm here tonight. Hello. So I'm here tonight to talk. I'm here tonight to talk to you about critical thinking and whether or not it matters. This talk used to have a different title, but my friends convinced me that that was sort of harsh. And so I needed to develop a new thesis, which was not that people are stupid, but rather that people think badly. But then that left me with a new problem, which was, why do people think badly? Well, my first thought was maybe they don't have a lot of formal education. But personal experience has shown me that formal education is no shield against shoddy thinking. Next, I thought maybe they just don't have good information. And then my final thought was maybe those people are just gullible. I was surprised to find out that that's a word that doesn't appear in any dictionary. Let me talk about some historical examples of bad thinking. This was Charles Ponzi. He was a charming Italian immigrant to the United States in the 1920s. And he had an amazing new investment idea. Word got around about this idea, and investors poured their money in. What Ponzi would do for you is if you parked your money with him for 30 days, he would return it with up to a 50% increase just 1 month later. So again, that became a very popular idea. Well, people at the time didn't realize that Ponzi was the inventor of what's now known as a pyramid scheme, also known as a Ponzi game. But until they realized that, a lot of people made a lot of money right up until they didn't, when the scheme collapsed. Ponzi went to jail for a brief time and then was deported back to his native country. Perpetual motion machines have held a real fascination for inventors for the last several hundred, if not 1,000 years. The idea of extracting free energy somehow is a very, very lucrative and seductive one. Now, to do that, you have to play with the laws of thermodynamics. Everybody know the laws of thermodynamics, right? You can't win, you can't break even, you can't get out of the game, right? So, that said, perpetual motion machines tried to defy that through clever systems using magnets and waterfalls and siphons and gravity and counterweights. They purport to extract free energy from the universe somehow. The patent office of the United States government was so besieged by applications for these things that finally they said, no more. Stop bothering us unless you can bring us a working model that you can park out in our outer office where it will run for 1 year with no intervention. And since then, applications have been way down. This is a rendition of snake oil. Snake oil is kind of a catch-all term from the last 100 years or so ago. Pre-FDA, Food and Drug Administration, anybody could put anything in foods or drugs, and they frequently did. A real popular ingredient in cough medicines at that time was laudanum. Now, laudanum we now know as morphine, which is an extremely effective cough suppressant. In FDA, pre-FDA, non-regulated dosage days, it's also an exceptionally effective breathing suppressant, which is one way to cure your cough. This is Ellen White. Ellen White was a prophetess. She told people around her that she was getting visions from heaven, and people started to believe her. They were listening when she told them that the world was going to end in 1841, and again in 1843, and yet again in 1845. Well, you'd think by then that nobody really would have been listening, but thousands of people flocked to her side. They doubled down on these failed predictions. When she predicted it yet again, the end of the world in 1851, people were not really disturbed that time. Maybe they were a little relieved that the world wasn't ending, but the important thing is she kept getting visions, and eventually she had a vision of a school on a hill, and she found a partner, and they built Loma Linda University. Rhinos. Rhinos came up in a talk earlier tonight, and I want to talk about rhino horn. An earlier speaker talked about a horn on a rhino that was worth $2 million. And the reason it's worth a lot of money is because of really shabby critical thinking. The idea of using powdered rhino horn as a cure for fever or impotence has been around for thousands of years. And because people are too dumb or too lazy to go out and buy aspirin or Viagra, we have this beautiful creature that's being driven right to the edges of extinction. Okay, well, so I've shown you that historically people think badly. Well, why do they think badly is our next question, and I have some renditions here. This is an example of what's known by psychologists as groupthink. Groupthink means when you're a part of a group that wears uniforms or has a secret password or is what psychologists call an in-group, it's really hard, literally, to step out of line with the decisions of that group. A member of the National Security Council of the United States government blamed groupthink for the unanimous decision to go to war against Iraq.
I heard about healthcare.gov and how easy it was to sign up. And with the new law, I was able to find a plan at $0 a month.
All plans cover doctor visits, prescriptions, emergency care, and more. Healthcare.gov is here for you. Enroll by December 15th.
You're never alone when you follow a dream. Breathe it all out now.
Asch experiment. Asch experiment basically was the Asch experiment was put together by a psychologist of that name, and he discovered that if you have people look at the line on the left and then ask them which of these three lines, A, B, or C, is the line on the left most like, if 9 people say A, the 10th person, not knowing that the other 9 people are collaborating in advance with the experimenter, that 10th person will almost invariably fall in line and say A as well, showing the power of social uniformity. This is my favorite. This is Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning and Kruger are 2 psychologists at Cornell University, and they became fascinated with the idea of incompetence after reading a story about a bank robber who successfully robbed 2 banks but was unsuccessful at evading capture. Now, the reason for that was that the bank robber knew that lemon juice can be used for invisible ink writing. And he made the jump in reasoning that if he coated his face with lemon juice prior to robbing the bank, it would render him invisible to the bank's security cameras. Now, that didn't work out so well. His friends identified him on the evening news, and Dunning and Kruger came away with their big takeaway, which was this: truly incompetent people are too incompetent to even recognize their own incompetence. Okay, so I've shown you historically people think badly. There may be some hardwired reasons we need to overcome with regards to thinking badly. There's a couple of tools. There's a lot of tools out there, but there's just a couple that I'm going to put out in front of you today. This is William of Ockham. He was a priest about 1,000 years ago who came up with what I think is a really great idea. It's now known as Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is this: all things being the same in any given situation, the simplest solution is usually the correct one. Seem good? So that means when you lose your keys, you don't need to invoke the CIA or alien abduction. Basically, you just laid your keys down, you were tired, and they're probably somewhere in your house. If you read a news story about an announced military exercise in Texas, you don't need to put together a conspiracy with secret prisons in the basements of abandoned Walmarts, because it's probably what it is on its face: a military exercise that's been previously announced in Texas. This is my favorite example. This is one I hope you'll take away tonight. This is Emily Rosa. Emily Rosa is the youngest person to have her name on a peer-reviewed professional paper in a medical journal, and at 9 years old. Now, the thing about Emily was she became fascinated with an idea that was making the rounds in the 1970s in the United States, a pseudo-medicine called touch therapy. Touch therapy practitioners claimed that they could see an aura around people, that they could not only see this aura, but they could touch it, they could manipulate it to diagnose and treat disease. It's hard to refute that. How do you know that I can't see your auras? It's hard to prove. But Emily Rosa asked for some practitioners to help her in an experiment. They willingly did so. I think they truly believed that they were able to see those auras and feel them, which was the critical part of her experiment. She had a large piece of cardboard, taller than her, and then cut a hole in it large enough to put your hand through. She then invited practitioners to put their hand through the cardboard hole, with her standing on the other side where they couldn't see her, and then tell her whether or not they could feel her aura as she suspended it above their hands. Well, when they added up the results, the practitioners didn't even do as well as the law of averages would dictate. So that was a multi-million-dollar industry brought down by a little girl with a big piece of cardboard. It means you don't need a lot of formal education or fancy equipment to be able to think critically. What about this? Does any of this matter? People say to me, Bart, why don't you just leave those people alone? Everybody can think what they want. I'm going, no, they can't. There's a reason for that. Let me show you why. And I want to say, not everybody is on board with this program. a major political party in a major state, I won't name either, it was the Republicans in Texas, passed a resolution in their legislature banning critical thinking in public schools. Which gives everybody here at SAS a big advantage because you're a private school, right? Okay, this is why it matters. About 15 years ago in New York City, this man began to offer this fantastic return to investors. If they brought money to him, a year later he'd return it with huge gains, no questions asked. And people didn't ask questions. Everybody recognize Bernie Madoff? This time, thousands of people lost millions of dollars, and lives, including that of the Madoff family, were ruined. This is Jim Jones. He was a charismatic preacher in Southern California in the 1970s. He convinced his followers that they were going to be persecuted and imprisoned by the US government for their religious beliefs. He invited them to a colony in South America, which he had founded. They did that. There, he grew increasingly isolated and more paranoid, and then finally told his followers that now the US government was coming for them, and they would be imprisoned for their religious beliefs. And the only escape was to follow him directly to heaven, which 900 of them did, drinking cyanide out of vats filled with grape Kool-Aid.
Your child needs these 3 key factors to get into an Ivy League or top 25 university. And it's not having a good...
Well, what about this? People say to me, well, maybe I could just do some research on the internet and then make up my own mind, decide for myself. I'll tell you, that's a really bad idea. This is what you get out of that. The anti-vaccine advocates over the last 2 decades have led the way in the resurgence of childhood diseases that were nearly extinct just a few years ago. Disneyland last year had an outbreak of measles. How 1950s is that? Some people, when they look up in the sky and see chemtrails, is what they see when they see jet contrails going overhead, and they say, oh, the government must be spraying us with nefarious chemicals for some reason. If you ask them, what about that? Where's your evidence? They'll say, sorry, you're either part of the problem, you're part of the conspiracy, or you're a dupe of the mainstream media. Homeopathy is a pseudo-medicine based on the idea that the smaller the dosage of a medication, the more effective it is. You heard that, right? And that means that these sugar pills I'm showing you should be perfect for curing the headache you're probably getting from this talk, because they contain 0% aspirin. They should be 100% effective. Okay, P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute. Actually, P.T. Barnum didn't even say that. One of his competitors did. But what it comes down to is there's always going to be a crop of new people coming along that need to be educated. You know somebody's going to walk out of here and go to their dictionary, right? And be looking under G for gullible. Let me close with this story. This is where this is all, is that it's not a process that's ever going to end. In Bali, in Indonesia, they tell a charming story of a creature called the rangda. And the rangda periodically comes out of the forest and clouds men's minds and makes them think badly and do evil things. And when that happens, the baranga needs to come out of the forest, and that's a power for good, and it battles the rangda, and it drives it back into the forest after diminishing it. But it can never kill it. It represents the struggle, the eternal cyclical struggle between good and evil. And I think with critical thinking, it's the same thing. Essentially, this is a process that's never ending, and it's one that we can't ever really hope to win, but it's one that we can't afford to lose. Thanks very much.
The typical grocery store is really a pay-to-play game. If you're a big brand...
Hey. Ooh, I got some of those. I got a bunch of those different things. The apple cider vinegar and the ranch dressing's got a lot of ranch. Most of this is ranch dressing. Okay, becoming a critic of your own thinking. This is from our second book, the recommended one. How skilled are you at critical thinking right now? Well, no matter what your circumstances or goals are, no matter where you are or what problems you face, you are better off if your thinking is skilled. As a professional, a shopper, employee, citizen, lover, friend, parent, in the realm and situation in your life, good thinking pays off. Poor thinking, in turn, eventually causes problems, wastes time and energy, engenders frustration and pain. Critical thinking is disciplined art of ensuring that the best thinking you are capable of is set circumstances. The general goal of thinking is to figure out the lay of the land. We have multiple choices to make. We need the best information to make the best choices. What's really going on in this situation? Are they trying to take advantage of me? Does a so and so really care about me? Am I deceiving myself when I believe that? What are likely consequences of failing to do? If I want to do, what is the best way to prepare for it? How can I be more successful in doing? Is my biggest problem or need to focus on my attention on something else? Responding to such questions successfully in the daily work of thinking, that's why we're thinkers. Nothing you can do, of course, guarantees that you discover the complete truth about anything. But there's always a way to get better at it. Excellence is a thought and skill in thinking real possibilities. However, to maximize the quality of your thinking, you must learn how to become effective critic of your thinking. And to become effective critic of your thinking, you have to make learning about thinking a priority. Ask yourself these rather unusual questions. What have you learned about how you think? Did you study your thinking? What information do you have, for example, about the intellectual processes that occur in your minds? Things more to the point, perhaps. What do you know about how to analyze, evaluate, and reconstruct your thinking? Where does your thinking come from? How much of it is a good quality? How much of it is poor quality? How much of your thinking is vague, muddled, inconsistent, inaccurate, illogical, or superficial? Are you in any real sense in control of your thinking? Do you know how to test it? Do you have any conscious standards for determining when you're thinking well and when you're thinking poorly? Have you ever discovered a significant problem in your thinking and then changed it by a conscious act of will? If anyone asked you to teach them what you have learned thus far in your life about thinking, would you really have any idea what that was or how you learned it? I feel like the most honest answers to these questions run along the lines of, well, I suppose I don't really know much about thinking in general. I suppose my life, I have more or less taken thinking for granted. I really don't know how it works. I have never really studied it. I really don't know how to test it. Or even if I do test it, it just happens in my mind automatically. In other words, serious study serious thinking about thinking is rare, not the subject in most schools. It's not a subject taught at home. But you focus your attention for a moment in the role of thinking is playing in your life. You may have come to recognize it. In fact, everything you do, you want, you feel is influenced by your thinking. And the monkey's uninterested in what goes on and monkey around. What's more, if you start then you pay attention to the thinking as a matter and analogies, the way to advance observe plans, and you be on your way to becoming a truly exceptional person. You begin to notice that few other notice. You're a rare monkey who knows a monkeying around is all about. You will be the rare monkey who knows how and why monkeys around. Skill in assessing and improving the monkeyness. When you're beginning to think about your thinking, you can look at one problem with my thinking is what? To come up with assumptions first. Do you get brain freeze? Why is this a problem? These are questions you can ask yourself. And good thinking is easy as bad thinking, but it requires hard work to develop it, you know? Like self-command of the principles of critical thinking. Kept alive in the mind by continual engagement in everyday life. Critical thinking, rather, something you add into everything else. Critical thinking, the way you do and everything you do, the way you shop, you teach, you learn, you vote, you relate, you evaluate, and so on. Critical thinking is personal problems, troubling emotions, bad habits, financial matters, responsibilities, future plans, our beliefs and values, personal relationships, key decisions, Politics in their life, opportunities, health, security, art, experience, and personal fulfillment. It's a hard, cruel world. That is true. We got to be critical thinkers. We don't want to be swindled. We don't want to be bamboozled. We don't want to be tricked. We want to make sure what we see is real and what we make is good choices. Most people, family members, teachers, acquaintances, business associates have multiple problems of their own thinking. Prejudice, bias, misconceptions, ideological rigidity, those are a few to help us directly and effectively to improve us. Become a critic of your own thinking. Second order thinking is first order thinking raised to the level of conscious realization, analyze, assess, and reconstructed. First order thinking is spontaneous and non-relevant. It contains insight, prejudice, truth, error, good and bad reasoning, undiscriminately combined. Problem, everyone thinks it's our nature to do so, but much of our thinking left of ourselves is based distorted, partial, uninformed, downright prejudice. Yet, quality of life in what you do, produce, make, and build depends precisely on the quality of our thought. Shoddy thinking is costly, both in money and quality of life. As a result, well-cultivated critical thinker raises virtual questions and problems, formulating and clearly and precisely, gathers and assesses relevant information, and effectively interprets it, comes to well-reasoned conclusion solutions, testing them against relevant criteria and standards, thinks open-mindedly within alternative systems of thought, recognizing, assessing as needs and their assumptions, implications, and practical consequences, and communicates effectively with others in figuring out solutions to complex problems. There's weak versus strong. We want to aim to be strong, but it's good to see the weak. That way, if we fall short, we become weak and we know why. Critical thinking involves basic intellectual skills, but these skills can be used to serve two incompatible ends, self-centeredness or mindfulness. As we develop basic intellectual skills that critical thinking entails, we can begin with those skills in selfish or fair-minded way. In other words, we can develop in such a way that we learn to see mistakes in our own thinking. Typically, people see mistakes in others' thinking without being able to credit their strengths in the opposing views. Liberals see mistakes in arguments of conservatives, and conservatives see mistakes in arguments of liberals. Believers see mistakes in non-believers, non-believers see mistakes in believers, and those who oppose things like abortion readily see mistakes in the arguments for abortion. Those who favor abortion readily see mistakes, arguments against it. So sometimes we can see how our narrow-mindedness can keep us from understanding the opposing viewpoints. I always say we can agree to disagree, right? Moving right along, you can see this little chart here. Critical thinkers strive to develop essential traits for characteristics of mind. These are interrelated intellectual habits that lead to disciplined self-command. Traits of the disciplined mind, intellectual autonomy, intellectual integrity, intellectual humility, intellectual sense of justice, intellectual preference, intellectual fair-mindedness, intellectual confidence and reason, intellectual courage, intellectual empathy. Then you have the traits of the undisciplined mind, intellectual hypocrisy, intellectual ignorance, intellectual unfairness, intellectual laziness, intellectual discard of justice, intellectual distrust of reason, intellectual cowardice, intellectual self-centeredness, intellectual conformity. What does fair-mindedness require? First, it's basic concept. Fair-mindedness entails the consciousness of the need to treat all viewpoints alike without reference to one's own feelings or selfish interest, or the feelings or selfish interest of one's friends, company, community, and nation. It implies adherence to intellectual standards such as accuracy and sound logic, influenced by one's own advantage or advantage of one's group. And intellectual humility, having knowledge of ignorance. We will begin with the fair-minded trait of intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is defined as having consciousness of the limits of one's knowledge, including a sensitivity to circumstances in which one's native egocentrism is like to function self-deceptively. This entails being aware of one's bias, one's prejudice, the limitations of one's viewpoint, and the extent of one's ignorance. Intellectual humility depends on recognizing that one should not claim more than intellectual knows. It does not imply smiliness or submissiveness. It implies lack of intellectual pretentiousness, boastfulness, or conceit combined with insight of the logic, foundations, or lack of foundations of one's beliefs. Sometimes you can construct your own list of most significant prejudice, maybe what you believe about your country, your religion, your company, your friends, your family, simply because the others, colleagues, parents, friends, peer, media conveyed you. Do you ever argue for or against views that you have evidence upon in your argument? Do you ever assume that your group, your company, your family, religion, your friends is correct when it comes to conflict of others, even though you have not looked at the situation, the point of view in which you disagree? You want to test the idea of intellectual humility, you can name a person you think you know well, and then make two lists. The first is include everything you know about the person. The second is everything you didn't know about them. For example, I know for sure that my spouse likes to garden, but I'm also sure that I've really understood that her fears and support desires were. If you knew the superficial things about her, but her inner self, I know a little, support what you claim by writing out an explanation of your thinking. So keeping that in mind, uh, you could look at intellectual courage. Intellectual courage may be defined as having consciousness of the need to face and fairly address ideas, beliefs, and viewpoints toward which one has strong negative emotions and which one has not given a serious hearing. Intellectual courage is connected to the recognition that ideas that society considers dangerous or absurd or sometimes rationally justified or whole or in part. Conclusions and beliefs included in the people are sometimes false or misleading. To determine for oneself to make sense, one must not passively or uncritically accept one has learned. Intellectual courage comes into play here because there is some truth and some ideas considered dangerous and absurd, and distortion or falsely in some ideas strongly held by societal groups to which we belong. People need courage to be fair-minded thinkers in these circumstances. The penalties of nonconformity may be severe. The opposite of intellectual courage, intellectual cowardice, is that fear of ideas do not conform with one's own. If we lack intellectual courage, we are afraid of giving serious consideration to our ideas, beliefs, and viewpoints, and we perceive them as dangerous. We feel personally threatened by some ideas that we conflict slightly with our personal identity, and we feel attack on those ideas as attack on the person. And we have fair-mindedness. Intellectual empathy is awareness of the need to imaginatively put oneself in the place of others to generally understand them. To have intellectual empathy is to be able to accurately reconstruct the viewpoints and reasoning of others and to reason with premises, assumptions, and ideas other than our own. The trait also correlates to the willingness to remember occasions when one's wrong in the past despite the intense conviction of being right and the ability to imagine being similarly deceived at the case at hand. You could try to reconstruct the last argument you have with someone. And my perspective was follow, state, and evaluate your view or the other person's view. All right, let's go ahead and look at our assignments. Uh-oh, I got logged out. Hold on. Thank you for waiting. I somehow got logged out. So we have right here, we want to summarize the main points of the event. We want to write how the main points of the current event connect to this week's objectives in the readings. and also how you want to apply what you learned in this organization. So go ahead and take it upon yourself to look up some kind of event, current event. You can go online and check out the news, or if you have other sources, that's fine too. But don't forget to say where the organization was that you're reading about. Yeah, you always want to give credit where it's due. If you forget about formatting, like I said, you can click here. It's a formatting guide. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but you have bold and italics. It kind of gives you a hint what you can do if you forget the shortcuts. Subscript, highlighted text. And to begin with, you can end with the text with appropriate symbols and display with desired formatting. You can also combine symbols like don't go overboard becomes don't go overboard. Hopefully, we'll create a clickable link if you have a valid URL also to address. So if you're going to put down the link where you found it, that's always great to have as much information as possible. Not really sure what's going on with my chickens today. Okay, you go to week 2. We have assignment there. I'm not sure what's going on with my chickens right now. But we have reasoning and critical thinking. We looked at the chapter 2 today. And your homework is to prepare a 500, can you guys see it? A 500 to 1,050 word paper. So you have a big gap in how long it has to be. Describing critical thinking, provide an example from your personal experience in applying to critical thinking to work-related decision or other decisions you have had to make a great importance. Explain the benefits of critical thinking and decision-making process as it applies to your decision. You want to create a drawing or graph also that depicts the steps that you took to make the decisions. This is going to be due on Sunday. And please keep in mind that we are in week 2, but if you fall behind, you can always go back to week 1 and do your work. Okay, thank you so much for being great. That concludes our week 2. And stay tuned for week 3. Bye, everybody. Have a blessed week. Keep up the good work.